Hello, my name is Abigayle Greier, and I'm currently a student at Russell Sage College, and I'm in the honors program. I'm a junior, and I'm finishing my last semester of undergrad studies before going into the grad school program for physical therapy. Today I'm going to talk to you about my research, The Lost Stories of Civil War Musicians. I started this research freshman year of college when I was in a class called War Stories. And in that class, we looked at literature from soldiers from World War II on and really analyzed their stories and then to the depth of what they were writing. And then when our individual project came, I decided to focus on the Civil War because I have such a fascination for everything American history from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And I wanted to focus on the musicians of that time because I've been a musician and have been a part of a musical family since I was born. And what I was struck to find was that when I was doing my research, there was no literature from the Civil War musicians specifically, because the musicians back then were very different than the musicians now. Any musician and musical group that are a part of any of the branches of the military are very much ceremonial based. While back then, musicians actually led the soldiers through marches, played during battles, and they were used as emergency personnel when they weren't playing if they were needed in the middle of a fight. So it was very striking when I was doing my research and I could not find any actual documentation or literature from the musicians themselves. So for my project, I decided to make literature of my own from these musicians. And I mainly used a book called In Remembrance of Wars Past by Henry Tawn. And I used the Library of Congress, pictures, obituaries, and basically timelines of the war. And what I did was I looked to find out on the timeline which regiments that had bands and had musicians part of it were in what battles at what time based on their obituaries and photos, and also that book, the Remembrance of Wars Past. And I used that to base and some of the stories of musicians that were in that to put together these stories and hopefully give you an idea of what the Civil War musicians were experiencing at that time. I decided to do poetry because since they were musicians, I thought that using that type of delivery that is closest to music without the song part, it's just the lyrics and the feeling of the music, would be most accurate to depicting their stories. So what I would like to do instead of reading the poems is tell you a little bit of background behind each poem, and then hopefully you will read them and discover your own idea and be able to visualize it in your head on your own. So the first one I wrote is called Yankee Doodle Richmond, and it's based on the story of James M. Caswell, who was a saxophonist in the 13th New Hampshire Volunteer Regiment Band. So this story was specifically developed through the emancipation of Richmond. So based on the book Remembrance of Wars Past, I was able to discover that James L. M. Caswell, as well as the sergeant that wrote the original literature, was in Richmond during the emancipation. And actually there is documentation and photos. So the first photo on the bottom is during the emancipation of Richmond. So James M. Caswell was one of the first people of the Union soldiers to walk into Richmond during the emancipation, because obviously the musicians led the bands through. So he was one of the first people into Richmond. And so that their Yankee Doodle Richmond is his story. And I used the Yankee Doodle because in the original literature by the sergeant of the 13th New Hampshire Volunteer Regiment Band, they played Yankee Doodle Dandy walking into Richmond. So I decided to use that story in order to place you in that time period and be able to see what James M. Caswell was able to see as he walked into Richmond. The second story I'm going to talk about is called Dear Father, and it's based on the story of Charles W. Washburn, who was a drummer in the 13th New Hampshire Volunteer Infantry Regiment Band. Now, this story was very interesting because this occurred during the Battle of Cold Harbor, and this occurred in 1865 and was one of the bloodiest battles. And what happened, and the most importance of this, is that it rained the entire time, and not even just like a rain, like a soaking rain. And so in this battle, it was really interesting because it was talked about in the Remembrance of War's Past book that I read. And this specific regiment went through extreme heavy fire through the entire rain, and the musicians, and it's written about in the book that the musicians were actually used in the storm and in the fight to carry wounded soldiers and the dead and drag them back to the camp. So the musicians dropped their instruments, and basically for the entire battle was going in and out of heavy fire, dragging the wounded and dragging the bodies back to the correct sides. And what I realized is that it was written about not by the musicians but by the soldiers, and I interpreted their words to see what the Civil War musicians would have gone through. But what I discovered is that how hard it would have been, because these musicians just went in, grabbed the injured soldiers, brought them back out, but was able to do nothing except for carrying bodies. That was the only skill they had, because they weren't health professionals. They were there as musicians. They didn't have guns or anything, so they were basically just carrying the wounded and then having to watch the wounded suffer and listen to that heavy fire and listen to the screams in the storm. So this story is super interesting because I used the one book that had the story of this battle in it and actually talked about what the Civil War musicians did to help in the fight, and then discovered Charles W. Washburn in that regiment, and then was able to change the story so that it reflected what he went through. So the last story I will talk about is the Trombone Lost at White Oak. So this story is based off of Harry Rowe, who is a trombonist in the 4th Vermont Infantry Regiment Band. I got this story through his obituary, and the photo on the bottom right is the photo of the Union 4th Vermont Infantry Regiment. It's 6 of the band members, and it's interesting because if you're able to zoom in on the poster after this presentation, you'll actually see a trombone hanging in the background. So that's super interesting. There's a really good chance that Harry Rowe is one of these band members. I do not know which one he is because I was not able to find an individual photo of him, but this picture is the 4th Vermont Infantry Regiment Band. So this story came from Harry Rowe's obituary, and so he was fighting at the Battle of White Oak, and he was playing and he was helping soldiers like lots of the musicians did. They were used as, an extension of the first aid. So they would go out and get injured soldiers and bring them back because they didn't have weapons or anything. So he was at White Oak, and his trombone, while playing, was shot out of his hand. And it talked about in his obituary, basically saying his story. And at the time, PTSD wasn't a thing. But for a lot of these musicians, having their musical instruments go through the entire war with them really helped them cope with what we call PTSD today. So in his obituary, he talked about when he lost his trombone at White Oak, it basically broke him, and that he was never the same after returning from the war. So I thought that was super interesting. So I was able to take that obituary story, and I was super lucky to be able to find this picture of the 4th Vermont Infantry Regiment Band. And then I was able to turn this story into a short poem that I feel accurately describes his feelings, because through his obituary and through family, you learn that he never really talked about the war. But basically that's because without his instrument, which these musicians, music was their way of communicating. Like, they didn't have weapons, they didn't really write in journals or anything, because they had their music to help cope with what they were going through. And for Harry Rowe, without his trombone, he wasn't able to deal after the war with everything that had happened. So those are the poems I wrote. Those are the stories behind it. And just in conclusion, and to make sure you know fully what I did with these stories, they are not directly written by any of these soldiers and these Civil War musicians. They were taken through a book, the Library of Congress, pictures and obituaries that I was able to find. And I was able to turn these poems into, I believe, the most accurate description and story from these people that I could do. And I thank you for listening to my talk. And if you have any questions, I will attach my email into this presentation, and I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you for listening.